Welcome to you as we switch gear this third Sunday of Lent, and because we can go from Mark into John for a moment, and we have a quite challenging passage, quite a confrontational passage. But first, welcome to Esme, who's just over the hill from me, or a couple of hills, or 3 hills, or about 100 kilometres away in Lauder. Lisa, who's in Palmerston North, a few more hills, and Esther, who comes to us from St Martha's, which is kind of an existence. So welcome to
Kia ora
you.
koutou.
And we have Lisa with some background, and well, it is confrontational. Where do you go with that?
There's so much we could say about this passage, Michael. And I think probably the first and obvious thing to note is that this scene takes place in quite a different point in Jesus' ministry compared with the Synoptic Gospels. So in the other Gospels, the clearing of the temple happens at the beginning of Holy Week, just after the triumphant arrival in Jerusalem, and it signals the end of Jesus' ministry. But in John, it happens really early. It signals the very beginning of his ministry. And what an entrance. Up until now, we have heard about the testimony of John the Baptist, the calling of the disciples, and then a very quiet miracle at the wedding of Cana. These events have been private, not notable by the wider public. But with his arrival in the temple, everything changes. And I was thinking of what he says at the wedding of Cana to his mother, "My hour has not yet come." Now it definitely has. His behavior is violent, forceful, authoritative. I'm paying attention to the detail of the fact that it describes him even making the whip. And, it's almost like you can see the muscles in his arms. It must have been a hell of a shock to everyone, including John's disciples, who'd begun following Jesus, who were used to a much more ascetic spirituality. So what we see here bursting in on John's Gospel is a man of action, someone who is going to shake things up. I think the other thing that we should note in this reading as well is that the way John shapes the opposition as the Jews, which surely refers to the Jewish authorities, but which has been used throughout Christendom as a justification for the persecution of an entire race. We should simply, I think, note that tragedy. As the gospel progresses, we see a clear delineation between the good guys and the bad guys as the Jewish authorities become more entrenched and more hostile to Jesus. But I think here in this passage, we should have some sympathy for them. A complete nobody arrives from the provinces and lays into the people in a sacred space. Their question is quite reasonable, mild even in the context. So I'll leave it there. I know there's a lot more to say.
All right, thank you. And just to underscore that we need to be very careful, especially at a time of rising anti-Semitism at the moment, to acknowledge that we're talking about something much bigger than a tribal people or a nation or a race. And we're also not, it seems, talking about gentle Jesus, meek and mild. So let's go to you, Esther, and find out what challenges you find here.
I love this story. Jesus causing good trouble, and I am here for it. It's interesting to try and work out what was the heart of why he was so appalled that day. And I don't think I know all of it, but definitely the fact that these money changers were forcing people who perhaps would have struggled to afford the demands of the law anyway, to change their money at random and unpredictable rates to temple money. And Jesus perhaps really appalled at this taking advantage of low-income people and putting barriers between people and God. But what was really striking me as the challenge today was trying to visualize. I really invite us to pray into this reading and to visualize for ourselves what this would have meant to pious Jews at that time, what it would have meant to a very Jewish Jesus, who we are told loves God's house in this reading, and to really try and imagine. This is such a brave thing to do, to cause such offense, to cause such protest. Maybe the bravest thing Jesus ever did. And I really invite us to try and visualize what would be a protest today, what would be an action, what would be a symbolic action if Jesus was today that we would find as visceral as this, because I think it's hard to even get our head around what this would have been like.
Let's go to you, Esme, and talk about what you find challenging, first of all, personally.
I just find the challenge is to not take it as Jesus having a hissy fit, that there's something deeper there. And to me, it's just getting my head around the fact that I have to look deeper and think about things more.
Yes, okay. So thank you, Esme. So it's quite a personal thing within Jesus. It's quite an institutional thing. Let's see where you take us, Lisa, for some words of challenge that you find there.
Yeah, well, I think the challenge of this passage is about the character of Jesus. He's not nice. He's not comfortable. He bursts into the temple and makes a whip, lays about him, calling out the practices that have been distorted for personal and financial gain. If we want a comfortable Jesus, an easy spirituality, John pulls no punches. He tells us from the very beginning, from now, and then all through the gospel, but that is not going to happen with Jesus. He's going to come into our house and confront sin and meanness and hypocrisy. And let's face it, we've all been guilty of that in some way or another. And the only options we have are to run away or to look at him right in the face, as the Jewish leaders do, and ask, by what authority are you here in me? Who are you? Who are you? And that's not easy. We've all run away at some time or another. But today, I think the question is, will we stay? Will we look him in the eye and say, okay, tell me about this. I'm up for this.
So he's inviting us to some pretty risky places at this moment. So let us ask you, Esme, where are you going to find good news?
I find myself, because I'm not a theologian, I look at things maybe with a slightly different view. I don't know. The good news that I saw was that Jesus is inviting us to have a relationship with him that doesn't necessarily need to happen in a building. And so as we close churches and feel really bad about closing churches, the good news is that we can still continue to be Christians and followers and do what we feel we are led to do. But we don't necessarily need to be only in a church to do that. I think that from this passage we learn that our mission is actually to build relationships in the community where we live and to reflect the teachings and to interact with others. And when we're closing churches, we can still do that.
So quite cool there for a relational mission coming out of this stormy passage. Let's hear from you, Lisa, where you're going to find us some good news.
I love what Esme said. I think that's really exciting. I hadn't thought about that. The way I'd thought about this was that the good news is the other side of what I see as the challenge. So when we ask, do you have the authority to do this? The answer is yes, he absolutely does. And all of John's gospel is a testimony to that. And he references his death and resurrection. This early on, he references that as the absolute authority. And there's a constant phrase I noticed, a commentary that runs through this passage and the wedding of Cana, and then throughout the gospel. And the thing that keeps on being said was, and his disciples believed in him. The author of this gospel clearly had heard testimony from the disciples. Then he did this, we saw what it meant, and we believed. So I think when he steps into our house, into our church, into our hearts, and starts at times laying waste to the sin he sees, we can believe in him like the disciples did. We can trust him. This is the work that needs to be done for our salvation, and that is good news.
Absolutely, and certainly drawing on a real central theme of John there, challenge to believe. So Esther, tell me some good news.
Well, I mean, I think it's great news that we have this Jesus that you've been describing, Lisa, who is willing to cause trouble, to mix things up, to confront institutional hypocrisy and be prophetic like this. But I also I feel like I noticed for the first time this year that what he said about how his body is the temple, and yes, if the temple is torn down 3 days later, it will be raised up. And I just think that's such good news that for us, Jesus's body, Jesus's incarnation is where God is living with us. And that's still true. And it made my mind go forward to Paul talking about the church as the body of Christ. We are the body of Christ. And, we can be really confident that when we gather, even as you said, Esme, if it's outside the church buildings, when two or more gather, that is our temple. That is Jesus, God, Emmanuel, God with us.
All right. Well, while you're on a roll there, Esther, let's ask you, so what?
I think, again, we get to a really challenging place because we have this very specific example right at the beginning in John's Gospel of Jesus's ministry and other places through Jesus's ministry where he does things that people find to be illegal or sacrilegious or very challenging to the established norms. Then he predicts, of course, that his disciples, he said, you'll be arrested and taken before the authorities to witness to this good news of the kingdom values of justice and love. And so I do wonder what Jesus would look around in our society today and what disruption, what trouble he would be causing today, and what would be the issues that would matter that much to him, and what he might be inviting us to do. A lot of the people I talk to, our minds are going to climate change as something that's causing existential risk for billions of people, for millions of species. But there might be any number of issues. But what is God calling us as disciples to go outside our comfort zone and to live into this story?
Thanks, Esther. I think it's not leaving us cozy at all, but nor does this passage at all. Esme, some final thoughts about so what?
I went on the so what again, like Esther did, with the fact of Jesus's body being the temple and the resurrection in 3 days, rebuilding in 3 days. And I interpreted it that so we're not called to build temples or churches, but to create and affirm that relationship that we have with Jesus as the foundation and the scaffold of our worship. To think about, again, I got back to that same sort of issue of where does the church building, is that the most important thing? And it's not. And then following on from that was whether or not, as the body of Christ, as the body of the church, that we can also be rebuilt in 3 days, so that if things get very disrupted and our world turns to custard, then it's possible that as a member of that body of the church, that our relationships and our strength can be rebuilt in 3 days.
All right, thank you. I like that as a place for you to leave us, and let's see where Lisa leaves us. So what?
I love the way we've come at this from a completely different perspective. I'm sitting here thinking about how to tie that all together. But I think the question for me is, and perhaps something to ponder this Lent is, are we up for this Jesus who might issue the kind of challenge that Esther's been talking about, or who invites us into the kind of relationship that Esme is talking about? So are we up for this Jesus? This Jesus who is not sitting around talking about theology. This is a man who is a man of action, a man who confronts sin without hesitation, who is unawed by petty pride or worldly authority and is outraged by injustice. A Jesus who will push aside our carefully erected defenses. The Jesus who steps into our life, into our churches, and says, through his actions, who do you think I am? And the question for us, I think, this Lent is, will we run? Will we step up? Will we believe him? Will we trust him? Will we align ourselves with the disciples and follow him? And I want to adapt something I heard in another gospel conversation that really struck me, and ask, when we give the authority of our lives over to Jesus, it may feel like a loss, but we have everything to gain.
Esme, Esther, Lisa, wrestling with a confrontational passage, challenging one. So thanks for being a part of this and for breaking open the gospel this week.